Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story began with a scandal that shook the entire empire. It was truly the scandal of the century, and the entire empire was delighted with the news of the wedding of the two most influential figures of the time. One of them was Decarno, the young head of the prestigious Tezin family, and the second was Evangeline, who was the only daughter of an incredibly wealthy count. Of course, all the residents had exactly the same reaction. They were incredibly happy to hear this news. All the inhabitants of the empire were very happy that these two families were finally united. This meant only good and joyful future. But the reality turned out to be very far from ideal, and all because Evangelina came to her fiancé one day and asked him to cancel the engagement. As soon as the man heard this, he was obviously shocked and surprised, not understanding how she could suggest such a thing. But the girl considered it a completely correct decision to announce the breakup right before their wedding, and this greatly influenced the fates of these two people. But to understand how all this came about, you need to look back a few months. All started in the ducal estate's Tezin. Evangelina sat on the bed and covered her naked body with a blanket so as not to freeze. The man turned to her and said that now that he thought about it, he wondered what his schedule would have been for that day. The girl, who knew this information perfectly well, immediately answered him that he needed to study the documents during the day, and after that, there was supposed to be a banquet at which he would receive guests. The man, of course, was not at all happy when he heard about the banquet, because for him it was very tiring and boring. Decarno looked at her and said that by now she should be able to handle such things on her own. He not wanted would constantly interfere with this. The girl looked at him in surprise and for a while did not know what to answer him. But then, smiling, she said that, of course, everything was fine. In a cheerful voice, Evangeline also asked him to continue with his work while she took care of all the secondary tasks. The banquet that was supposed to take place that evening was, after all, dedicated to her birth, and of course, the girl understood perfectly well that it would be quite logical if her fiancé at least showed up there for a while. But Decarno didn't think so, and after a while of silence, the girl asked if she should help him tie his tie. The man, after his intimate affairs with his bride, had already dressed and said that he could have done it himself, so he did not need her help at all. Evangelina, despite being upset, understood that she could not take up the busy Duke of Thesen's time just because it was her birthday. And besides all this, their marriage is nothing more than a political marriage without any love, just the fulfillment of marital duties and formalities. The girl smiled and said that they would see each other a little later. After that, the man, without even saying goodbye, simply closed the door behind him and left. Then Evangelina, still covering herself with the blanket, rang the bell. Of course, she was a little disappointed, but she understood that she didn't need to talk nonsense even for that. After all, she lived in the ducal house of Tezin and had to learn to endure. Otherwise, she did not deserve to bear the status of his bride. The maid immediately entered the girl's room. Bowing, she asked the mistress if she had called her. Evangelina immediately asked the maid to bring her food and tea, as well as contraceptives. Several hours had passed since then, and the celebration had already begun. Many aristocrats began to gather around, who, upon seeing Evangelina, immediately congratulated her on her birthday and chatted pleasantly with the girl. She immediately thanked everyone for these wonderful congratulations, and also, talking to one of the aristocrats, said that they were probably very busy, but she was very pleased that they came anyway. Then the woman bowed to her and said that it was not even discussed. Despite all the things that awaited her, she, of course, found a way to get to this wonderful event. After that, she ran closer and grabbing the girl by the hands, said that the banquet hall was simply amazing. All the decorations and treats were wonderful. She also told Evangeline that the atmosphere was perfect for her birthday, so she was very happy for the girl. The Duke's bride herself, smiling happily, replied that since the Duchess of Thesen's memorable evening was to take place very soon, she made the event much more modest, but was still very glad that she liked it. Evangelina also said that there was nothing wrong with it, but she was very glad that the guests could enjoy the evening with her. Another lady, talking to her friend, said that she had great doubts about this lady because she thought that this was the level she needed to be at when she had to marry a member of the Tezen house. But one of the noblewomen, looking around, said that she could not see the Duke of Thiessen anywhere, and everyone was very surprised, assuming that he had certainly gone away again. Another friend explained that he was always very busy. But then she suddenly shut her mouth and said that the banquet was in honor of his fiancée's birthday, and of course he should have at least shown up for a few hours. Therefore, the girls already began to assume at that moment that this whole engagement and their marriage were only because of money and an agreement. They already doubted that there was any spark between the young couple. As they continued gossiping, Evangeline suddenly came up to them and said that they were indeed absolutely right. As soon as the girl who was saying various nasty things about this saw the lady, she immediately fell silent and was simply horrified because she did not expect to meet her. Another lady immediately apologized and said that she was simply disappointed that she did not see the Duke at the event, as she had very much hoped that she would have been able to say hello to him. Evangeline kept a calm expression on her face and smiled, replying that she understood how alone they felt, but she thought it was best not to spread any such rumors that evening. The girl, smiling, explained that it would be better for them to behave as if they were not at this celebration at all, and simply remain invisible for their own well-being. She also said in a quieter voice that if it was too difficult, she should just drink herself to oblivion. The aristocrat knew she was wrong, so she laughed nervously and immediately began to pour wine into herself, saying that it was probably the best choice. And her friend turned to Evangelina and suddenly pointing somewhere to the side, told her to look and see who had come there. The girl was immediately a little surprised to hear this, and when she looked to the side, she saw one of her fiancé's servants. The girls, seeing this, immediately began to whisper. Together they thought that the Count had sent her a surprise gift, and they were immediately interested in what it was. The girl immediately took the black envelope he handed over, and the aristocrats began to assume that this was probably the rarest diamond that could exist in this world, and he wanted to give it to his bride on her birthday. Others believed that it might be the right to an island or a luxurious imperial estate somewhere far away. But as soon as Evangelina opened this letter and read it, she did not understand at all what it could mean, because it said that her father had disappeared. The girl was simply crushed when she heard this news. She could not understand how this could happen, and recalled her father's words, who said that he was ready to give her the whole world. He always called his daughter a princess, and was ready to give his last means to make her happy. Count O'Hara was the most free in spirit empires. This was a man who ran the largest trading company in the entire empire, and the business was quite successful. He was a father who loved to travel all over the country, strengthening connections. Wherever he went, he found many acquaintances and new partners. Evangeline had always admired her father, and he had once again set out on a new journey to observe the excavations that were taking place nearby. But in this letter, the girl learned that, due to some mysterious events, he was unable to return back, because along the way, the merchant fleet completely sank, leaving not a single survivor. And the worst thing for the girl was to find out on her birthday that her father's fate was now unknown. They couldn't find a body, but there was no confirmation that he was still alive. The girl, of course, immediately tried to calm down. She understood that she needed to save face and first confirm all the facts about his shipwreck. She turned to the same assistant who had brought her the envelope and asked if he could call Philip from the O'Hara Trading Company. Despite the fact that there were many emotions inside her, the girl on the outside remained completely calm and confident. She rude voice said to that called his immediately. At that very time, the Duke was in the reception room where he was talking with another very important person. Descartes, reaching for his pen, suggested continuing the discussion a little later and asked if they would like to have some tea. But then suddenly one of the men replied that this was absolutely not necessary. He also asked how many hours had passed and added that the man really was a match for his family. The Duke then suddenly looked at the other side of the table, where the naval Colonel Philo was sitting. The man was very serious and was examining a paper that Dakar had handed him. Then suddenly this Colonel Philo turned to him and asked if he had really missed the banquet in honor of his fiancée's birthday in order to go to work. He said with admiration that the guy, as rumors said, was really married, just to his job. Of course, the Duke didn't like that. He immediately asked what he meant. Philo, smiling happily, asked him what kind of reaction he had, and asked him not to say that he did not know about it. But the man asked him to be a little quieter because he was giving him a really bad headache. The naval colonel continued the conversation and said that there were various rumors that he was so obsessed with Lady O'Hara that he did not even allow her to leave the house. He asked if he thought that all these rumors might have a reason, and when Dakar was about to answer something, he didn't have time, because a girl burst into the room without knocking. It was Evangelina. She had run away from her party, and as soon as the Duke saw her, he was very surprised. Straight away, Same asked what she there did. But the girl could not maintain her manners and apologized to him for long. She took off her cloak and immediately asked if they could talk for a while in private. Dakar immediately rose from his seat and began to chase the colonel and his assistant away, telling them to leave them, and also explaining that it should not take long. And so, when they walked out the door, the man came closer to her and immediately asked what urgently brought her to him, and also inquired whether she was not supposed to be present at the birthday banquet. Evangelina answered in a confident voice that the banquet was completely unimportant at that moment, because she wanted to tell him something very serious. But then suddenly Dakar interrupted her and replied that he was actually at a meeting and asked her to return while he came for her as soon as the meeting ended. Of course, the girl was not happy with this turn of events, and she said that he didn't even know when it was supposed to happen. The girl also said that she knew that when there were budget meetings at the beginning of the month, he might not return home for several days, and it was for this reason that she came to him and asked him to give her just a little time, because it was incredibly important. The man didn't want to listen to her anyway. He suggested they talk after the meeting and asked her to go with Michael and wait in another room, and he would come to her as soon as he was free. Evangeline realized there was no time to wait any longer and said that her O'Hara family was bankrupt. As soon as the man heard this, he was incredibly surprised. He looked at her with a serious look and immediately asked again what she said. The girl now realized that all attention was focused on her, and she replied that all their trading ships had sunk to the bottom, and her father had simply disappeared. Then, with a mocking voice, she asked if he was still ready to listen to her, even after hearing the information. After this, the Duke simply had no choice, so he left her in the room and told her to tell him everything in detail. He also asked again if she was really sure that absolutely all of her family's merchant ships had been wrecked in the Roman Sea. The girl understood that even though it was a strategic marriage, she was still surprised by that look, which was colder than that of a stranger. But she felt that this was absolutely the wrong time to be thinking about such things. If she wanted to find out what had happened to her father, she had to get his attention. And after being silent for a while, Evangelina finally looked at him and said that she simply needed his help. In a quieter voice, she also asked if he could gather the soldiers and immediately search their sea in order to understand what had happened. Dakar was silent for a while and did not answer, but then suddenly he told her to come back. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She was about to turn to him, but the man interrupted her. He told his bride that she had come to the royal palace quite suddenly, so news of this, of course, immediately began to spread. And he thought that if the situation escalated, it would be very difficult to control, so he told her to leave. Evangelina was incredibly upset. She immediately said that her father's life was completely uncertain. Perhaps he was still at sea and waiting for help, and he was worried about some reputation. She also said that time was of the essence, but the man didn't want to listen to her. He simply told her to return to the event and stay there until the end. The girl couldn't believe that he had actually become so heartless. Her father might have already died, and he was just telling her to sit quietly at home because people might think something wrong. Then she came a few steps closer to him and said that if he was not going to help her, then she could do it herself. But Dakar suddenly reached out his hand to her and told her in a calm voice not to stick her head out and just wait quietly. He began to put the hood back on her head, hinting that she should leave, and said that this was exactly what a future duchess was supposed to do. After this, he explained that he would definitely inform her immediately as soon as the first news appeared, after which he would still escort her out of his office. Evangelina was shocked. She immediately thought of her father and did not know what to do. She could not help him at all because she was simply powerless. Of course, it was hard for her to accept the fact that just sitting and staying in the estate was all she could do in a situation like this, when she didn't know if her father was even alive. Quite a lot of time had passed since then, and one day, while walking in the garden during the day, Evangelina wondered when she would be able to hear news about her father. She was always thinking about the bad and thought that something terrible could happen to him, and therefore she was also always thinking about what she could do in such a situation and how to influence it. As she approached one of the flowers and picked it, she immediately remembered the words of the Duchess, who said that these flowers were simply delightful. The woman also, looking at them, explained that it was a blue rose from the continent across the sea, and it was especially valuable in their garden. The Duchess explained that this particular story always reminded her of her travels with her father, so of course she fell in love with this flower very much. When she saw the delighted expression on Evangelina's face, she said that this garden was soon to be hers. The only person who was kind to the girl was the late Duchess. She was an incredibly sweet person who always enjoyed Evangeline's presence. Looking at those blue roses, she thought that if this woman were still alive, perhaps she could convince the Duke to move forward with this investigation. Then suddenly the girl heard some noise behind her, and when she turned her head to the side, she saw that a huge white dog was flying straight at her. The animal also barked joyfully at the sight of the girl, and when Evangelina called him to her, she immediately stroked him, because he was the dog of the duchy, and his name was Lex. She was very happy to see him and immediately asked him if he had come to console her, because he felt that she was in a bad mood. Lex immediately licked her cheek in agreement, and she thanked him, saying that she was making sure to stay strong. But at that moment some noise was heard nearby again, and as soon as Evangeline turned her head to the side, she saw that a man was approaching them, and when he came closer, she noticed that this man was her fiancé, and at the sight of him she was very surprised. As soon as Lex saw Dakar, he immediately began to growl. He did not really like the man, so he treated him with distrust. Evangelina greeted him and tried to calm the dog down because he was about to attack him. Then she came closer to him and immediately asked if there was any news about her father, and the man, sighing heavily, replied that, unfortunately, nothing had been confirmed at that time. Of course, she became even more upset and said that she understood everything. Every time he said such words, Evangeline became even more nervous because she understood that there was less time left, and the chances of finding her father were also decreasing. But she thought that it was only natural that there was no information since they had just heard the news. But still she couldn't just sit still. So in a quiet, worried voice, she said that she couldn't just sit at home locked up and feel constant anxiety. Evangeline explained that she still wanted to at least visit the crash site, and perhaps she could find some trace that might indicate his presence. But then suddenly the man answered her very loudly and cruelly, so that she would not be so stupid. Dakar came closer to her and replied that she couldn't do anything anyway, even if she went there. The best search parties were working there, and if they didn't find anything, then she certainly couldn't. He also said that she would only cause a stir by doing so he forbade her to go there. Evangelina, upon hearing this, immediately became upset, and then asked if he really told her that in such a situation, she should just sit and watch. The girl said that all the ships sank, and as an heiress, as a daughter, she must understand the whole situation, because her father is the only blood relative and her family. But Dakar was starting to get irritated by all this, and, raising his voice even more, said that the information about his death had not yet been confirmed. But even if he was dead, the girl only needed to think about the big picture that happened then. This in itself would have been difficult if it had simply been the head of a trading company or his assets that had lost themselves, but the puzzle was also that the assets had disappeared entirely. And so the man believed that if the girl had also become the main topic of gossip, then not only the Count, but the entire O'Hara Trading Company would have been completely ruined officially. The man, as if stating the fact of her father's death, said that even if he returned alive, it would be too late to save him. The girl just stood there with her head down and couldn't even say anything about it, and Dakar asked her to just wait quietly, and that's all. Evangeline could not understand at all how this could happen, even if their relationship had always been confined to the boundaries of their roles. It continued to be a mystery to her how he could be so cold and distant when the father of the woman who would have been his wife went missing. The man didn't see anything special in this, so he couldn't even console or support her. After a long silence, she said that he really was just a terrible person, impossible to deal with. As soon as he heard this, he was very surprised, and turning around, began to leave, saying that if she understood what he said, then she should do it. Evangelina remained standing there, filled with a lot of negative emotions after that horrible conversation, and she just didn't know what to do. He repeated to her to just wait without any decision, and she couldn't understand if he really expected her to obediently do all this. Of course, that wasn't the case. Given the situation, Evangeline had to go out and find out what was going on outside the walls of the estate, since no one told her what was going on. However, in fact, there was something that the girl definitely didn't know. Some time ago, when the man was still at the meeting, there was an awkward silence between. Descartes told all his assistants that the final documents had to be submitted within 2 days. He looked very angry, and so everyone began to fear him. The men immediately replied that, of course, everything would be done. After that, the fleet chief lingered, as he was asked to do it. He noticed that the man had been in a terrible mood for several days after that meeting on Lady O'Hara's birthday, so he thought he had to put aside the military budget, but he couldn't talk to the man calmly, because he was simply afraid that something had gone wrong. Well, he still plucked up his courage, since it was a very important task, and approaching the Duke, he said that he needed to ask him for something. But Descartes suddenly interrupted him and was about to say something, when he suddenly changed his mind and turned to Pylon. The man, frowning, immediately asked what he wanted, and the Duke replied that he should take the soldiers and go to the Roman Sea. As soon as the guy heard this, he was very surprised and immediately asked what the man was talking about and how he could do this. He explained that the Roman Sea was in Kala territory, which meant they couldn't go there. The fleet commander also said that he didn't want to send an army that was their former enemy, and they didn't even finish the war with them. They just froze them. But the guy replied that they had a truce at that time, so he didn't understand what the problem was in doing as he asked. Pylon was shocked, but he knew he was in no condition to argue with his commander, so he simply remained silent. When he handed him the paper, the Duke signed it immediately and said that it should be enough to cover the expenses of the journey. It was a pretty good check for a large sum, which really covered the expenses. Several days passed from that moment, and Evangeline actually went to the O'Hara Trading Company. As soon as the girl got there, she was amazed by the scale of production and work that was going on around her. Her even nobody not addressed attention. She had certainly taken quite a big risk when she came to that place, but when she saw the whole situation, she did not understand how this was possible. The girl was surprised because at first glance the company looked very good, as if nothing had happened there. The last time Philip told her that their entire fortune had already been contributed and that she had left the company with nothing. But given this factor, the girl did not understand why everyone around her was so calm and continued to work. At this moment, someone finally noticed the girl and immediately approaching her, addressed her. This man was precisely that same Philip. He was the manager of the O'Hara Company. The man ran closer to her and asked in an alarmed voice what brought her to them. Evangelina asked in surprise what he meant, because if her father had not been in this place, then, of course, she would have come to check how things were going and what was happening. Philip replied that he fully understood how she felt, but he still felt that she did not need to be there, as it was completely unnecessary. Evangeline didn't understand at all what was going on, and why he didn't want her to stay there and possibly even see something. So she asked why she wasn't welcome in the company. When the man didn't answer, she noticed that his expression was quite calm, but at the same time surprised. She thought that he thought she might reveal some secret while she was in this place. And then, suddenly, when Evangeline thought about the fact that rumors about her father's accident had not spread at all, it surprised her. But when she realized what it could mean, it hurt this girl very much, because she assumed that most likely it was influenced by, of course, Descartes. She was upset and did not understand why he constantly treated her like this, because even an ideal self-living person who had lost the name of a great magnate could still be useful. The girl then became very serious because she was no longer going to allow this man to decide her affairs the way he wanted and thought. So, in a very serious voice, she turned to Philip and said that while her father's fate remained uncertain, she was the current owner of the O'Hara caravan. So she demanded that the man tell her the whole truth. When Philip was about to say something, he did not have time, because a new person appeared behind him. When the girl turned her head to the side, she saw Baroness Revan with her friends in front of her and was very surprised. It was Linda Revan, and she was a distant relative of the ducal house of Teze. The woman came up to Evangelina and, taking her hands, smiling, said that she was very worried because she did not look well on her last birthday. But now that she saw the girl, she was glad that she was completely fine and in good health. Of course, Evangelina was unhappy to see her and did not understand what this woman was doing in the caravan. She assumed that she had most likely come to buy herself some new jewelry, but she doubted it. In fact, 2 years ago, when the marriage with Descartes was concluded, Evangeline's father began to hand over the goods of the caravan without hesitation to all those who were connected with the ducal house, as a sign of gratitude and in order to strengthen their ties. Those who had once obtained wealth in this way often stopped at the caravan to take more for themselves because they liked it so much. And this woman was just one of those people. Evangelina was outraged by her shamelessness from the very beginning, but her father gently reassured her and said that there was nothing wrong with it. Smiling, he looked into his daughter's eyes and said in a gentle voice that nothing had been in vain for his princess, so he insisted that she had no need to worry. He always explained it by saying that if a small amount of money could bring his daughter peace of mind, it was worth it. He always wanted to protect her and support her, even if it meant giving away jewelry for free. At that time, Evangelina thought that her father was very naive, but now that she had encountered this family personally, she began to understand everything. He loved her so much that he was ready to give up absolutely everything for the sake of her well-being and happiness. So the girl became even sadder, realizing the fact that she did not know what was wrong with him. Linda took Evangeline's hands and said that she had a gloomy expression again. She explained that she had been very worried about her and wondered why they didn't have a cup of hot tea together. The woman was quite old, but always in fashion, and said that, after all, they were like one family, so they had to maintain these close ties with each other. The woman, smiling, also said that she could certainly spare at least this little time for her, so that they could be alone together. As soon as Evangelina heard this, she did not understand what she was talking about, because of course, this woman could not care about her. They were just waiting for her to show her weakness, and then they could take advantage of her without any difficulty. And despite the fact that in the realm of kinship they were practically strangers, they shamelessly closed the distance if it meant that they could get something valuable in return. Up until this point, Evangeline had tolerated this out of respect for her father and the Duchess, but now she was not going to allow them to behave like this any longer. So she took Linda's hand and pulled her away from her. She asked the Baroness for forgiveness, but said that she still had very urgent business to attend to, so she had to leave. She also told the woman to take her time and look around, and perhaps even buy something if she needed to. Linda was about to say something, but she didn't have time, because she turned around and left. Girlfriends straight away same started whisper between, by yourself. They had heard that the girls had been quite close before, traces of O'Hara, But now the Baroness had misunderstood the situation and had only disgraced herself. Linda followed Evangelina and said that she had come to this place only because she had been promised to be shown the best jewelry that was there. She also said that she wanted to clarify one very important thing. She asked for forgiveness, but she would have to wait a little bit before that happened. Evangeline was already incredibly exhausted from this meeting alone. She didn't want this family to tire her out even more and use her so unceremoniously. So, stopping, she said that she had to go outside and stand there for a while, because the girl was really panicking and couldn't collect her thoughts. Linda immediately approached her and, grabbing her by the shoulder, was about to say something, but when she was not distracted, she turned her around and said that she was actually talking to her. Evangelina immediately yelled at her and asked her to leave her alone and stop clinging to her. As soon as the Baroness heard this, she was very surprised. She realized that she had gone a little too far with her assertiveness, and she even felt sad that she had not been able to influence the girl. The Duke's bride screamed loudly and asked them to leave her alone. Philip was about to say something and ask her for forgiveness, but he did not have time because a situation occurred that no one expected. A rather large woman ran out of the door that led to the street. She grabbed Evangelina by the hair and started screaming at her very loudly. This woman, with tears in her eyes, spoke about how pathetic she was a witch, and also that if anyone had to die, it should have been her father. She was saying something about her son and crying non-stop. She really wanted her son back. He died absolutely undeservedly and unjustifiably. O'Hara from this crazy woman immediately ran into the room, and they ran up to the future Duchess. At that moment, Philip ran up to her and immediately asked if everything was okay with her, while the guards dragged this crazy woman away. The woman at this point continued to scream and said that while she lived in luxury, her son was fish food, no one respected him, and everyone simply used him. Evangeline's assistant immediately looked at her face and noticed that she was seriously injured. She had a scratch on her face that was even bleeding. The stranger continued to talk about how they should execute this woman, arrest her and punish her according to her deserts. Evangelina suggested that most likely this woman was a relative of one of the sailors who were on that ill-fated ship. But what surprised her most were these knights who appeared at the moment she attacked. She couldn't believe that they were already prepared and were just waiting for this moment. Her suspicion that this man had predicted that she had secretly escaped in order to visit the caravan turned out to be true in the end, because Philip, when he saw her, was not even surprised, but simply began to drive her out. Dakar most likely found out in advance that she had run away and warned everyone. In the evening, when she returned home, she was supposed to meet him right away. He said that he had warned her earlier that she should just sit in the estate and wait. Then he looked at her with a stern gaze and asked if she felt relieved now that she had gone out and checked everything herself. Evangeline sat silently for a moment, her head down, and said that she had simply confirmed what, as the heir, she had a right to know personally. Because the man didn't tell her anything, she just had to take such extreme measures. And besides, she said that she couldn't stay in that place without a specific date. She felt like a prisoner who was left locked up, but the man told her to keep quiet at least until their wedding and try not to get involved in all this. As soon as Evangelina heard something about the wedding, she was overwhelmed with emotions. She clenched her hand into a fist and did not understand what he said at all. She couldn't believe that even after all this chaos he wanted to marry her, and especially since there was no precise information from any investigation. The girl immediately looked at her fiancé and said that the O'Hara family had fallen, and her father had most likely just died, and she could not believe that he was talking about marriage at a time when she had lost her only family. But Dakar did not surprise her, and only asked in an angry voice, did she really consider her father her only family? But the girl completely ignored him, and he asked again, was there really someone else with her? Evangelina explained that her mother, who was divorced, was left with just a forgotten name. She had no brothers or sisters, only a father who always loved and cared for her. Also, the only person in the duchy who ever showed kindness to Evangeline was the former duchess. But she is already gone. When she saw the strange expression on his face, the girl did not understand what it was connected with and why he suddenly became silent, although he always tried to respond to her words. But then, suddenly to her surprise, Dakar came closer to her and leaned over, leaning against the sofa. They looked straight into each other's eyes, without taking their eyes off each other, and the girl did not understand what was happening at all. The man looked completely different now. His actions were not at all like usual, and so Evangeline wondered why he behaved the way he did. The man, who was much closer to her, suddenly noticed that something was wrong on her face and asked what had happened. The girl, without showing any interest, replied that it was just a small scratch, so there was no need to worry at all. The man, still incredibly close to Evangeline, suddenly asked in a quiet but calm voice if she wanted to tell him how she got this wound in the first place. But the girl, of course, didn't answer. She just looked at him with an empty gaze and wasn't going to justify herself in any way. Dakar understood everything. He moved away from her and told her not to worry in that case. He called Michael, who was an assistant. The man immediately entered the room and addressed His Majesty. And the Duke asked that from that moment on, he restrict the girl's access to the western entrance. Michael himself was incredibly surprised when he heard this, and said that this territory officially belonged to the Duchess, so he was not sure that he could do this. But the Duke was not going to listen to him, and said that no one was to leave the estate without his permission. Evangeline, of course, was not surprised at all when she heard this, because she expected that he would try to control her again. But she doubted and did not know whether the man really always saw her as nothing more than his property, for which he bore some responsibility. When Dakar looked at the girl, and saw that she was looking at him with a surprised look, he asked if she was finally ready to talk to him. But the girl only replied that it was not so. Of course, this made him even more angry because he had planned on having healthy communication with her. The Duke began to approach her closer and was about to say something, but did not have time, because Evangeline got up from her place and began to leave. Without even turning around to say goodbye, she said that she was going to leave immediately, and that was it. The girl walked out the door and closed it behind her, without even saying goodbye to the Duke. She just left, proudly raised head. Michael then approached the Duke and asked for forgiveness, but said that this incident was also unexpected, so they did not react immediately. Dakar understood perfectly well that someone had attacked her, so he immediately asked who it was. His assistant didn't understand what he was talking about at first, but when the man looked at him with an icy gaze and slowly asked, pronouncing each word, who left a mark on his woman's face, he immediately understood everything. Of course, Michael was very surprised that he called Her Highness his woman, but he said that he heard that it was a sailor's family. But before the Duke could say anything else, the boy replied that if he was going to punish this woman, public opinion was certainly not favorable to it. So he suggested that perhaps it was best at that point to just let it go. Dakar thought for a while, and then replied that, as a last resort, he had to find out who had leaked the information, since he couldn't act normally. In fact, news of the accident usually reached them only after a month, but somehow the family of a simple sailor who was on board already knew about it, so the man was going to find out about it. And besides, Evangeline, who was the heir to the Merchant Guild, received this tragic news in a letter only a few days ago. Therefore, the man believed that there was no sense in all this, so what he was just obliged to figure out into all. The Duke said it had to be one of two things. Either there was a survivor who had spread the information somewhere, or someone under his command had turned traitor. Michael immediately became worried. He began to shout loudly and replied that it was certainly not him. He was practically begging the Duke to believe him because he did not want any problems for himself. Dakar didn't react to this at all. He simply said that since it wasn't a man, then he had to find this traitor. He had to bring to him the man who had spread the rumor that the Count's ship had sunk, and this had to happen as soon as possible. When the next day came, Evangeline began to read various horrible headlines about an incident that had occurred at Lady O'Hara's Merchant Guild. The newspapers also wrote that Count O'Hara was believed to be dead, and news about her family eventually spread throughout the empire with incredible speed. The girl was, of course, surprised because she did not expect that this news could spread so quickly. She hoped that she would have some more time. Since Tokarno blocked the western entrance to the mansion, she lived only in her extension and was limited in her movements. Of course, the girl even began to think at some point that she would simply suffocate if she could not go outside. However, spending time alone and quietly turned out not to be as bad as she could have imagined. The girl was, of course, left alone with her feelings and emotions, but at least she had time to sort them out. But even despite this, Evangeline did not understand why she periodically felt a heaviness in her chest and could do nothing about it. Of course, she assumed it was because the familiar space now seemed foreign to her, or because she simply felt powerless. During her daytime walk, the girl was interrupted from her various thoughts by the voices of the crowd, which came from the closed gates. All these people who gathered there were relatives of the sailors who died in that terrible accident. They blamed, of course, the woman and said that she should have taken all the responsibility. People were crying and screaming that their poor children had died, and they were also demanding blood and punishment for it. Evangelina was amazed. She stood and looked at all this in surprise, not understanding how these people could get there at all. But at that moment, the Duke appeared in the crowd of people, and walking closer to them, immediately asked, "What is all the commotion there?" One of the protesters, seeing him first, was very surprised to see the Duke, and he explained that they were simply demanding justice and compensation, which was why they were there. Dakar replied that if they had business, it would certainly be more correct to enter through the main entrance, rather than through the annex, and address him directly. The man understood his mistake, but he simply did not know how to justify himself, because they came to the extension specifically to mock Evangelina. After all, they considered her guilty. But when the Duke looked at him with a stern look, he said that he would call a lawyer and settle this matter in a reasonable way, and not by such prehistoric methods. After that, the gate opened and he entered the annex. And the man who had been talking to him all this time bowed and thanked His Highness. He was still glad of such a resolution to the conflict. After this, the Dakar approached Evangelina and suddenly, in a very angry voice, asked what she was doing on the street again. The girl immediately asked him for forgiveness and said that, of course, she would immediately return back. She explained that just went out to take a walk. Dakar suddenly grabbed her by the waist and decided to take her to the room himself. They walked in complete silence. Of course, the girl was alarmed by all this. She did not understand why he did not say anything. And besides, she thought that he would scold her, because such a crowd of protesters in front of the Duke's mansion was probably very shameful. Of course, she assumed that it was probably just because there were a lot of eyes watching them, and he decided not to make a scene in front of everyone. Evangelina considered his behavior very strange, because he did not even demand a single apology for the shame that had been brought upon his home and family. So she, of course, began to suspect something there, because she understood that his attitude never arose from pure goodwill. When the girl finally came to his estate, he simply closed the doors behind her and left. After this, the man went to a meeting with very important people who were discussing this very issue with the protesters. Of course, they were very surprised that some collectors and strangers broke into the Duke's estate and were unceremoniously there. One of the girls even said that when she looked outside, she found it hard to breathe just from the sight of this deadly crowd that was screaming and even ready to break through the gate. Of course, Descartes had to be present at this meeting, but everything was too noisy and he could not concentrate. The rumors were spreading too quickly, of course, and it worried him. So he turned to his uncle and asked, did he really just stand there and watch all this? Count Len, who was in the palace of the covered Duke, immediately shouted and said that it was completely irrelevant in their situation. The Duke asked, "Is it really of no importance that the future Duchess was harassed by debt collectors?" Of course, his uncle, upon hearing this, did not believe it and told him not to make him laugh and not to say that he really planned to marry this girl. Dakar was silent for a while, irritated by the fact that all his relatives happily accepted gifts from the O'Hara family when it benefited them, and almost idolized them. But now that the Count's wealth had simply disappeared, they immediately turned away from this family and even began to humiliate it. The man thought it was very hypocritical, and he couldn't believe that it was really his family. After all, they were completely pathetic, but the man answered his uncle's question that it was quite obvious. It didn't matter to him what they all said, because after all, there was no one more suitable for the role of Duchess than Evangeline, and he was not going to back down from his principles. Of course, his family was immediately very surprised and said that they did not understand what he meant and how he could have made such a reckless decision. Absolutely everyone present disagreed, but most of all it was his uncle. He slammed his hand on the table and asked, "What kind of nonsense was that guy talking about?" He asked the guy not to tell him only that he really fell in love with this woman. The slightly calmer man said that this marriage was clearly harmful to his duchy, so he asked why he didn't just break off this engagement for the sake of their family. Dakar looked at him with an angry look and could not believe that they had still been playing out all this pretended loyalty to the duchy. Then the uncle said that while this place was free, it could be filled by a person who could really benefit them all. Evangelina, who was standing near the door and accidentally overheard this whole conversation, was amazed. The girl understood perfectly well that they had come, most likely, to demand that they break off the engagement, because she knew perfectly well that now her family had no status. This meant that she-them became useless. Then suddenly the uncle, after a short silence, immediately asked what the reason was for his being so stubborn, if it was not love. As soon as the girl heard the word love, she was very surprised and could not believe that they could really assume that Dakar could have any feelings for her. The Duke immediately replied that he was still going to marry the Evangeline, O'Hara, and he didn't care at all what everyone else told him, and he wanted to do this because there would be no more convenient woman than her, and for this reason alone he was going to marry her. As soon as the girl heard this, she could not believe that he actually called her a convenient woman. Uncle, hearing this answer, immediately smiled and said that if he was simply looking for convenience, then of course there were other daughters who had a little more influence and could become the same. He also said that this concerned the Duchy of Teza, so the imperial family could also intervene, and indeed, as Count Ren said, there is always a way out. However, Dakar interrupted him and said that he hated awkward questions and therefore suggested ending the conversation there, because he saw no more point in it. In fact, Evangeline's first encounter with Descartes took place at a banquet for a hunting party. The man, who was not very fond of such an event, was alone on the balcony with a glass of wine, in order to at least take a little rest from all this fuss. And when the girl came out there and met him, she bowed and immediately said that it was an incredible honor for her to finally meet him. She introduced herself, and the man, having noticed her, immediately said that he really liked Miss O'Hara. Evangeline, who never raised her eyes to him, also heard that Dakar had said that he had heard many good things about her from Count O'Hara. To outsiders, it might certainly have seemed like a normal meeting between two people, but in fact, it was a meeting that was carefully organized by both families in order to make it seem more natural. The girl's father, despite having no interest in hunting, paid for a membership in order to take her along to the event. And Dakarna didn't want to show his face at the banquet to his real mother, but he simply had to come there. And when the two of them found themselves at that event at the same time, their eyes met, and after that the girl went out onto the balcony and met him there. This was how they first met, gradually increasing the frequency of their conversations. They developed their relationship, and soon Evangeline entered the Duchy of Teza. He never disappointed her and was always the person she could imagine being with her for the rest of her life. And she supposed that perhaps it was for this reason that at first she might even have hoped that they could exchange feelings of love for each other and be together in the end. Although after she realized that he had no affection for her, it was a dream that she very quickly abandoned in order not to torment herself. But still, ever since they were engaged, Evangeline thought there must have been another reason why he chose her. But now that she heard this conversation, she realized that the reason he stayed with her was because she was convenient for him. She couldn't believe that it could be such a trivial reason. From the beginning, their engagement had been an alliance of money and power, so Evangeline knew that she shouldn't be surprised now that she knew the truth. But for some reason, the girl felt a little heaviness in her chest again. Because he had kept her close, even after her family went bankrupt, she thought that maybe they had some chance of having a normal relationship with each other. She even assumed for a moment that he saw in the gospel O'Hara had some value as a person, but all this was just her thoughts and illusions. Simple self-hypnosis. At that moment, she took the wedding ring off her finger and placed it on the bedside table, thinking that she was just pathetic. She knew that having such expectations when she was damaged goods was absolutely useless, so not had rights get upset. That same evening, when this meeting was over, the man was sitting in his office and writing down some various papers. He had, as always, a lot of work to do, since he was a duke, and then suddenly he remembered the words of his uncle, who had been very indignant when he suggested that he had real feelings for a woman. Sighing heavily, Dakar leaned back in his chair and couldn't understand how he could have even imagined anything about love. Evangelina O'Hara was simply ordinary and very convenient for him, and it was for this reason that he kept her close to him. She is elegant and rational, and is exceptionally good at hiding her emotions from everyone. Even when she was feeling terrible, she would put a smile on her face and act as if nothing had happened. Her dealings with people were, and truly were, impeccable, because she was also rich in knowledge, and there was no sense of inadequacy when dealing with her. There was always something to talk about. She was a duchess, and coming from a Tetza family, had all the necessary qualifications for the role. That's why the man saw no one better in the role of the duchess than Evangeline. She was just ideal perspective for this. And now that he thought about it, he realized that she only had a small scratch on her face. But he knew that it must have still been pretty painful for her, even from that. At the same time, the girl always hid her emotions and kept everything to herself. Then suddenly Michael came into his room and, turning to the Duke, asked if he had called him. The man immediately said that it was so, and then, handing him the paper, asked him to put it up for auction. As soon as his assistant heard this, he was very surprised, because it was Rothko Plains. He immediately said that a sale that would lead to significant losses, this particular deal would be very unprofitable. However, he asked Dakar if perhaps he should reconsider his decision and consider other options that would be much better for him. But the man, in a gruff voice, simply asked his assistant to follow instructions and nothing more. This was the most fertile land of the empire, and there were always, of course, many people who wanted to get these lands. Putting it up for auction would have fetched a price that would have more than covered Evangelina's debts, and that was the reason the Duke had done so. He knew that the girl had to be just the perfect duchess, so such a sacrifice, in his opinion, was just a small price that he was happy to pay. And so some time passed from that moment, and several people gathered in the great imperial palace. And one of them, in fact, was Dakar's uncle. The girl who lived in that palace immediately asked why he decided to honor her with his presence, although before that he swore that he would never return. The guy didn't want to answer anything, and she only asked what brought him to her. Count Ryan laughed nervously and said that he never said that he would never return, and also added that Princess Bologna probably just got it all wrong, that's all. The girl who sat opposite him was Fiona Fond in Elitz, and she was the younger sister of the Emperor of the Grand Ducal Empire. But in fact, 3 days ago, Count Leon met with the Imperial Princess, and that meeting was indeed very emotional. The man was in his estate, and unable to contain his emotions, he threw a vase of flowers somewhere towards the door, which simply shattered with a huge crash. He yelled at the girl and asked, "Did the guy really think that the Tez family grew up solely through their own efforts?" Len was incredibly angry at the Duke, from whom he had just recently returned, precisely because he had made what he considered to be a simply terrible decision. The boy continued to shout, saying that the power that the ducal family currently held was only maintained thanks to the cooperation of the more supportive branches of the family. And besides, the man was very irritated by Dakar's behavior, which was acting as if he had achieved everything on his own, although, according to his uncle, this was absolutely not the case. Moreover, he even rejected the woman they introduced him to, without even considering her candidacy. He was still very stubborn and chose, for some reason unknown to him, Evangeline. In his uncle's opinion, this was simply a wonderful option to improve their family's lot. This woman could bring an incredible amount of benefit to their family. But for some reason, he didn't understand. He chose Evangelina, whom he didn't like at all. He didn't trust this woman and assumed that she could even set them up. Leon thought she would be a spoiled brat because Count O'Hara raised her with such incredible care, and he still held that opinion. He was also incredibly irritated by the fact that she, not even being the Duke's wife yet, still imitated the former Duchess and tried to do everything as if she was the boss there. Of course, it was simply terrible for the man to watch this, and he did not understand how Dakar could not notice all this and ignored the obvious facts that were right in front of their noses. His uncle felt that he couldn't let this happen. He had to get rid of them all at once, and so he felt that if he got the imperial family involved, then even his family wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Fiona turned to the Duke and asked if this was why he had decided to approach her. The girl didn't like what she heard, so turning away from the man, she said that she didn't think he had come all this way just to ask how she was doing. She understood perfectly well that there was something else hidden behind all this, and she wanted to get down to business as quickly as possible so as not to delay. Len, laughing nervously, immediately said that he had no special goals in mind. He had simply not seen Her Highness for a long time, so he decided to take the opportunity to congratulate her. He also said that as a member of the Teza family, he was supposed to serve her, but he didn't, and of course, he deeply regretted it. The man said that she must have heard that there had been a lot of unrest in their house lately. Fiona, hearing this, said that she had indeed heard something about it, and replied that in that case she would not mind. But then she suddenly asked in a surprised voice, "Were all those rumors about the O'Hara family falling really true?" The man said that unfortunately it was true, and Fiona replied that in that case she was very worried about the Duke. Looking down, she said that even if Lady O'Hara hadn't caused him any trouble, he still couldn't leave her for the sake of the family's honor. So she would now understand perfectly well that the man was in danger because of his own principles. As soon as Len heard this, he immediately noticed that her attitude changed the moment he mentioned Dakar and its condition. This made him a little wary, but he decided to take advantage of the opportunity and said that in fact, this also worried him madly. In order to get the girl on his side, the man also said that in this situation, it would be better for His Excellency to break off the engagement with this unfortunate woman. He also added that he wondered whether he was in a relationship with her just because of public opinion or not. But Flack said that he believed that this so. As soon as the man looked more closely and saw the expression on Fiona's face, he immediately became happy because everything was happening as he expected. Despite her reserved appearance, the imperial princess had a rather fierce character that was not immediately apparent. If there was anything that caught her attention, she would not rest until she had it completely, and it was for this reason that the man knew perfectly well that he had turned to her at the right time. Len knew very well that Dakar had liked this girl from the very beginning, so it was only natural that she was going to fight for him until the very end. Of course, this man was no exception. She not only followed the Duke of Teza at every event he attended in order to admire him a little, but she even dared to beg, with tears in her eyes, her brother the Emperor, so that he would arrange everything so that she could marry him. It was a well-known story in high society, and there were many sacrificial rumors about it, so Fiona even fell a little in the eyes of her aristocratic acquaintances. Unfortunately, the Emperor had no intention of giving more power to the Duke, so he ignored his naive sister's request, as he knew he could not do so. Fiona was devastated by this, but despite all this, she still wanted to get Dakar for herself, because it remained an unfulfilled goal on her list. Therefore, Leon knew that the princess was the perfect option for him to use for his own interests and purposes. The man believed that if they made her believe that she could get what she wanted, Then she would take over the task and keep Evangeline under her own strong control. So, after a short silence, the man turned to her and said that it was for this very reason that he asked what she thought of getting Lady O'Hara to propose breaking off this engagement. As soon as Fiona heard this, she was truly shocked. The girl asked in a quiet voice, did he really think she would give up so easily? She also assumed that since Dakar had left her until now, it only meant that she was very difficult to communicate with. The man, still smiling in a calm voice, replied that of course it certainly wasn't supposed to be easy, but he also said that this woman appeared with excessive pride, which, of course, is best addressed at the beginning, before it is too late. As soon as Fiona heard this, she immediately got into a fighting mood. And the man also said that you never know, if her pride is hurt to an unbearable point, then perhaps she could retreat in a fit of anger. The next day, Fiona still went to see the princess, because she considered it necessary to meet her and do her pushes. She was worried that she had invited her too suddenly, and told the girl that she probably should have at least made an appointment in advance, so as not to distract her. But Evangelina, with a smile on her face, replied that she was nevertheless glad that she had called her when the Duke was away. Fiona, smiling, thanked her for this, and said that she was glad that she was allowed into this place without any problems. The girl also thought that she was probably just bragging that Duke Teza had protected her, but she thought that this high pride certainly shouldn't have lasted long with her plan. While sipping tea, Fiona turned to Evangeline and said that she had heard about what happened to the O'Hara family. She added that the girl was probably deeply affected by this incident that happened to the Count, and it was very difficult for her now at such a time, and she wondered if it was true that his body had not yet been found, which meant that she did not know for sure whether her father was alive or already dead. When Evangelina heard all this, she was amazed at her impudence, but she calmed down a little and said that the search was still ongoing, and also added that she appreciated her concern. Of course, after what happened, her mood worsened, but she tried not to show it in public, so as not to aggravate the situation. Fiona was actually surprised, because she thought that the woman would at least shed tears as soon as she remembered her father. But she turned out to be completely indifferent, even after that. There was silence between them for a while, and the woman realized that carrying out her plan would be even more difficult than she could have imagined.